How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eulero Gonzalez here, and today let's going to now explore what is the way of how we can styling in React. And frankly, in previous versions or in previous videos, I have looked at how can we do that, how lengthy and verbose it is when it comes to actually adding some sort of CSS to our React components. Okay, because at the end of the day, React components, they are just functions call, and since they are that, we need to find ways to inject that somehow into our CSS. All right, so the TLDR of all of this is that, to make this quick recap of the entire model, is to first understand what is React, what is the problem that is solved, who developed React, and what are the challenge that, for example, Facebook back then in software engineering at that moment, uh, they have when it comes to look at particularly problem issue that appears on their message drawer icons, because that message constantly appear, and when users click on that and there is no any new message, uh, so this was a problem because, as you can imagine, if you are in this Facebook team and then you are not only is receiving all of this several chunks of uh, or all of these tickets to solve issues and bugs, and then a recurring one comes, this is playing like guacamole. And because now Facebook has developed an internal tool known as React, where the idea is to having one particular state, keep it synced with all the UIs that you have. And this was revolutionary back then because now, by centralizing one everything in one single state, we can now actually sync to the other UIs components that needs that piece of information. So this is the magic of React, that using is this piece of context or concepts and apply to get something real, something of value, and not only to be applied on the web, but also on the mobile, for example, with React Native, okay, uh, as well as the 3DG, which is something that I definitely wanna dive deep into this. It won't be in this course, but I know that it'll be in other courses out there. But in any case, the point is that, uh, because each one of those environments, whether it is the browser or the mobile or the web 3GL, right? Uh, each one of them now is a or provide or has its own set of directive. In the case of the DOM, HTML tags. In React Native, it has text, pressable, view, among others. And in the WebLG, you have is now things that are a little bit more abstract. So, for example, like camera or geometry or lightning. So the idea of this is to look at how can we create our own React. And at the end of the day, this is just an object, which is a unit of information, right? Which is in JavaScript, the language what we use to actually create our programs to do things specifically by providing us a set of statements or expressions to do the thing that we want us to do. So, uh, in the case of writing this user interface, or writing this piece of information in an object like, right? we were aware to, at the end of the day, understand that when we creating is our user, or when we define is any of these small tags, behind the scenes what is doing React is to take that and convert into a React elements. So because this is something that is lengthy and verbose, creating your elements over and over and over and over anytime that you want to define is a directive, in the case of the DOM, or in the React Native, or in the WebLG, okay? Because this is something that is quite monotonous and tedious to do so. We look at what GSX is, which is this markup language which combines JavaScript with HTML. So because of this, we know what is a GSX, which is a markup language that is used to transpile by React into JavaScript code. In other words, take each one of those particularly elements that we define, or the syntax that we define, okay, and transpile into a JavaScript. And the transpilation is just a fancy way to say, hey, let's gonna take one language to another high-level language, right? So, for example, from JavaScript from C to JavaScript, or from Python to Rust, and so on and so forth. So this transpilation, and when it comes to understand how GSX works, is to first understand what is the GSX expression, which is using the curly braces, and how inside of this is evaluating is JavaScript expression. And it's important for us to well understand what a JavaScript expression is, whether it's a variable assignment or an expression in itself. And this variable assignment or expression, if you take a look now at the ECMAScript here, but I do want to look is at the ECMA 2026, the latest syntax here. And we navigate to the the annex here. Like I do think is on the no bibliography, no, is, so if I search here and say, for example, hey, this is the what is an expression, right? Here in the clause 2, that's right, I was close. Here is describing is what is an expression here. Hey, it can be an identifier, it can be a geo, it can be an await. Okay, it can be an identifier reference, it can be a binding identifier, a label, a primary expressions, all right, whether it's a literal, a right literal, object literal, function expressions, call class expressions, generator, async functions, so on and so forth. So all of this is just to describe what are the things that we can do inside of this syntax, right? So this is to describing the expression slots, and now the difference between is the GSX and inside of this expression slots is to also is describe what is doing behind the scenes when you converse that, and why it's important to you understand the type coercion. And the subtle difference between the GSX and the HTML. There are some reserved keywords in GSX, and that the tag is case sensitive, the attribute is case sensitive. We have also closing self-closing tags, all right, and now the white space. and why the white space here is useful to add some, well, spacings. And the difference between the GSX and the templates, right? The template engines. So for example, like Blades or any other template engine out there. So now the point is that because GSX, unlike all of this template engine, is something that is uh, required you to learn, is a specific template language of how you can now show elements or render a collection of elements. Here, we don't have to do that because we can natively use is JavaScript. And I find that out very, very, very compelling. So because this is the way of how we're going to now write our user interface in this GSX syntax, we also look at the approach of writing user interface, which is the component base, right? So where inside of this we have now is the CSS and the JavaScript and the HTML, all bundle it into one user element. So we look at what is the syntax, how this syntax looks like, what is the rule of thumbs of this component that it must follow is the capital letters, all right? What is the anatomy of this component, right? So how it receives now the props as well as the children props, and all of this happening is at runtime. So because at the end of the day, we are declaring is a component, aka a JavaScript function that is gonna return is the GSX, and when that GSX is transpiled via Babel, all right, into JavaScript code, what's going on behind the scenes is that at runtime, right, when the React element is being created, it actually passed the props as well as the children, right? So this is quite interesting because we are looking at a particular pattern called the dependency injection, and I do think this is one of or the mystifying what is this stuff at the end of the day, and how the things actually is working. So this is now the component, all right? So we look at a particular exercise of how can we do that, how can we create our own components, what is these components look like, what is this component is getting rendering, okay? And because especially when you want to render now several elements or several components that are repeated, but their contents might be different, okay? We need to look is that how can we iterate through that? So these iterations, which is in our case now, how do we mapping over a collections of values? And this mapping is part of the functional structures and paradigm in JavaScript, where now in JavaScript not only we have is the primitive value, we also have the objects as well as functions, and this three distinction is something crucial when it comes to apply not only is the object-oriented programming but the functional approach. I know this go beyond the scope of today, but I do think this is quite important to at least mention is each one of them, just for the sake of the next thing that we're gonna talk about, which is the iteration, man. So because iteration, at the end of the day, is something that comes in with the language in a form of the iteration statement in the language, right? So we can is do that in several ways. We can is iterating using a for, or iterating inside of the GSX, so mapping over data. And as we mapping over data inside of our GSX, X, okay? Because at the end of the day, any time that we are mapping, or in other words creating, is this repeated list of elements, React behind the scenes needs to identify or needs to find a way of how to identify each one of them. So it doesn't automatically does that. We need to actually is provide is a hint via the key. And as we started to look at the iterations, all right, and the keys, and how now a project applications looks like, how a traditional application in React looks like, where you have now uh, the index, which act as a setup. This is when you import your CSS, for example, or you run is some error analysis, error log. Uh, on the app, this is the home base of the app. This is when we add in stuff like context and so on and so forth. And the other is the um, the ES6 models, or the files, the JavaScript files, where we define is our UI in each one of them. So because a good segue here is to describe also this convenient particularly component that React provide for us, known as fragment. So if we want to render now a collections of elements, but we don't want to wrap them, or we don't want to pollute is the DOM, using is a div to wrap all of this, we can use now is a React fragment to avoid polluting the DOM. And this might be quite silly example here, all right? But it's quite useful, especially if you have now a huge application with tons of components, right? Let's say you have renderings now, hundreds of components, which is not weird at this stage in the development. So this is good. This is great. So instead of wrapping your component inside of a div, which is something that we did, or we could do with an HTML, we can now wrap this is in a fragment. And fragments, as I mentioned before, it doesn't pollute the DOM. So it doesn't add any DOM to that. And also allow us is to wrap this several HTML DOMs into one. So as we progress and as we move towards, right? By looking is so by looking is or exploring is how can we iterate through our collections, the nuances, or iterating in our collections, and actually how the key works behind the scenes, okay? Which is something that we are going to see that later on. But when it comes to now conditionally rendering elements, right? So for example, in other libraries like Vue or Angular, where you have a specific directive to do that, for example, like VIF or VShow, here we have now several ways of rendering those elements, right? So all of this is using is JavaScript. This is one of the things that I really love about now React, is like it is reusing a lot of the things that we already know. And the people that were involved into this, the designer of this tool, actually my respect. So in any case, here we have is several ways of how can we actually is render conditional components, whether it's using is the double ampersand or the n, which is there is an algorithm that is followed. It is specified here on the docs here. So for example, like this, which is known, this is the logical operator, logical and expression here. So for example, what is doing this? all right, and hear what it's actually telling you. This is also the reason why I find that out reading the docs quite useful to get to actually understand what this thing is truly doing. And again, remember, this is the spec, and the other is the implementations. So some JavaScript engines out there might implement things quite different. This is not a, a, a rule. In fact, all of them must stick to the law, but due to their legacy reasons, some of them might now is opting to not go to this. So, in our case, they actually follow this spec. And if you want to know what are the spec that they don't follow, here is this in Annex B is where you can actually take a look at this. That describes this certain behaviors that do legacy reasons. Well, now host environments actually use that, right? But in any case, here we look at the runtime semantics. So anytime you read the spec, the doc here, all right, there are now two particular, I will say, phrase that are quite relevant. All right, one of them is static semantics, which is doing now, in this case, what you do is this, the assignment, okay? Static semantics is doing some early errors, all right, to actually verify that at least you provide some sort of, or to the compiler, to the JavaScript engine, now can identify is this errors earlier. Okay, good. Now, on this, okay, this is the static semantics. Again, the idea is to identify that JavaScript, if not in essence, JavaScript, if in essence, if not in practice, is a compiled language because it actually now has a phase when it has an error detection phase, which means is that it's what compilers actually is doing behind the scenes. So in any case, the point is to identify that static semantics is a phrase that exists to tell that this is what happened to detect some early errors, all right? And then you have now the runtime semantics. So what happened at runtime? And in our case with the double ampersand here, the TLDR is that whatever value you're gonna get here, okay? Especially here, this double ampersand will act as a gate for the value that you return. So if the left operand in this case return now a falsy value, whether it is an empty string, whether it's an empty string, a null, undefined, false, -0, 0, and then so if that return any of these falsy values, since it's trying to coerce that into a boolean, and if return false, then it's going to return you is the value that is. This is interesting. It's not a return is false. It's going to return you is the falsy value. And I do think this is quite important to at least to recognize, to understand that, because especially when you are going into the triple E, right, or with the double E, the way of how you can conditionally render elements, whether it's an if, all right, which is known as early return, okay, or using now the end inside of your GSX template, all right. When it comes to the GSX template, when it comes to adding or toggling between elements you want to show, and how now, since if you pass now a falsy value here, it's going to return you now the falsy value. 0 is what is a falsy value, but you want to render that in your template 0. So this is why when we evaluate this with the double ampersand here, this is when you evaluate this kind of stuff, it is important for you to coerce that into a true boolean. So there is no, this is usually something that you might find here by using the double exclamation mark. One of them is to coerce that to a falsy value, and the other is to actually verify to get the value as it is. Okay. And why inside of this, especially when you want to evaluate length of collections, how we tend to use or we tend to go is with the evaluation of that. Okay, so not like that 0 is being rendered, but in that case we want is just coerce that, which is what we're doing here, is to coerce that. So this works as the if statement, and we are doing is this, okay, for those cases. But what happens when we do need to actually is render is the if and else statement. So that's what we have now, the ternary condition, which is using is the question mark. So this question mark, which is going to evaluate, and again, locally that we are here, is going to evaluate this condition expression, and again, it's going to short circuiting that. So usually we go with this, the short circuit expression, okay? So let the LF be the evaluation of the short circuit expression, and let the LF to be the boolean of that reference, okay? So whatever value that we're getting here, we're gonna coerce that to a boolean. This is what the to boolean is, this abstract operation, which is just a fancy way to say that this is the kind of algorithm that happens without your consent internally in the language. All right. So we have now the to boolean, the to numeric, to number. All right. So far we have looked is at the most common one, which is the to boolean, the to number, like this, and what is going to coerce that? The to boolean, the to number, the to string, like this. The to string is what is going to return this. All right. So if argument is null, return null. If argument is true, return true. Is false, false. It is a number. Return now the stringification of that in base 10. If it is a big int, the same into base 10. Assert is an argument, is an object. Okay. And let the primitive be to primitive argument dot string. Okay. So again, it's now calling is it to primitive. It's like trying to attend to coerce that with a string like. Okay. And assert prim is not an object here, and then return this, right? So assert if the prim value is not an object, then you're going to return that, right? Return now the to string to the prim here. So the idea of this is just to illustrate that what's happened here when you're trying to coerce that. Okay, so for example, the to string, okay, why the to string when you try to do the string and then you coerce that, it gives you now this object stuff. Whereas if this is an array, it's going to give you now is an empty string. So all of this is just things that are important, at least for us to understand that how the language actually works behind the scenes, okay? Because as we move on to what we really care in this lesson, to is evaluate how CSS is being applied to the React component. This particular evaluation or reading for understanding this kind of semantics is also very important. To get the idea, to get the understanding of where the things are coming from. So in any case, we got this left ref and left vol, all right, and this is what is happening here. It's say, hey, I'm gonna evaluate this, all right, and then in this evaluation is I'm going to get is the value from this, and that value I'm going to now coerce that into a boolean. So if the value that I coerce from this boolean is this, give me a true t value, which is not any of the falsy value, because it's much straightforward to know the falsy values for per se. So if it a true value, then let the true ref be the evaluation of the first assignment, which is this, all right, and then return the value of this first assignment. This is actually telling you what this algorithm is doing. So for example, if you say, hey, let me say let name, and this is now Euler, right? This is Euler. Well, so give me is now, so for example, if this is true, if this is any true t value, all right, and there is a long list of true t value, but for the sake of simplicity, let's go to put this way. Let's go to do this, right? This is a true t value. This is a true t value, right? You're gonna say, hey, Euler. Otherwise, no. Return undefined, right? So in other words, the name will be is Euler, right? So the algorithm of the abstract operation actually works and behaves the way as it is, as it's supposed to, right? So another thing is that we can say, hey, another true t value is that might be counterintuitive, is something like this, is 0. An array is another one, right? If you can say this, you get the name Euler. Another that might be counterintuitive is 1. So you get name, all right. And another true t value is that, for example, this is going to return us now is undefined, okay. So if you pass any string, is in fact is now whatever string it is in fact now is a true t value, all right. So you get now name Euler, but you get the idea here. However, if it's not, then I want you to give is the second assignment here, assignment expression and returning this value. So I know that might be quite overkill to understand that, but this is something that if you are able to read this, or in my case, I am able to read this, I am now understanding is what are the things that's going on behind the scenes, and I can point the source of it. And this for this mechanical stuff is actually pretty straightforward. For mechanical stuff, it's pretty straightforward. So with ternary operator, this is what we can do. For example, is now a condition, all right? And not only that, how can we use our conditions here? And this is another interesting aspect here. this is a very interesting aspect here. So let's say if our function, especially with console log, so is a function here, condition, all right? Because at the end of the day, functions is another type of values, right? So if you are evaluating is this, right? And then you have now the console.log first, and the second is the console.log second, right? Something like this. So what will be the thing that is going to be output here? Okay, so the thing here is that since console log is a function and this function return now an undefined value, is gonna not only to evaluate this, all right? It's not only going to evaluate this function, but after that, the ternary operator is gonna now say, hey, I'm getting a falsy value, therefore I'm gonna move through this and run this function, which is condition second, right? And again, this is because the nature of the value in JavaScript. Remember, primitive, exactly. So primitive, objects and functions. So for example, if your function, if you create now a function here, let's say function name, right, or bring name, or if you want to return now another function here, let's say is take name, right? We're gonna take name, and then here we say, hey, I want to return now is another function, okay, that is gonna say is the last name, and then I want is to return is the name plus last name, right? Last name, like this. And then right down below I say take name here, and then I call this, and I say this will be Evelier, right? And then I assign to this, all right? So for example, I say, let's say this is the name. So what do you think this will be? It is a function, right? So if for some reason you say take name and you pass now this name, all right, to here, yeah, and then you pass this take name to this layer here, and then you evaluate this and say first condition or second condition, what do you think that it's going to print here? Because remember that at the end of the day, it's actually is fortunately telling you, but at the end of the day, when you run this and it's gonna give you now a function, and a function, when you evaluate that, since there is a well-defined falsy values and function is a true value, then you're going to evaluate this kind of stuff. But if for some reason that function returns some undefined, which is what most functions are if you don't define anything, for example in the case of console.log, all right, condition, then it's going to do this kind of stuff. Again, the point of this is, especially when it comes to understand how can we conditionally render elements, whether it's in an if, or using the end or the ternary, what is the trade-off of each one of them. And as we move on to the other strategy that we can use to rendering elements, right, conditionally rendering elements, is via CSS. So with CSS, which is showing and hiding the elements, right? We can pass as a particular style, and given that property, we can say, hey, I want you to render this uh, if this property exists, or if I receive this property. If it is, this will be the style. If it's not, then put it undefined. And the good thing of this is that when you pass to GSX an undefined value to an attribute, uh, React, it won't uh, attach or create that attribute into the HTML DOM, which is a great stuff. It doesn't take that, it doesn't add that attribute to that. So this is great. This is quite compelling, quite interesting, and uh, and why we didn't use this the display none, or you can use the display none as a way to actually is now take elements out of the DOM, so on and so forth. But when it comes to choose what is the right strategy, there is no good or wrong. Okay, there's only one that is very specific to the job. So in this particular exercise, we'll look at how can we provide support for screen readers, and I do find very compelling, especially because a lot of actually people out there are asking for things that how can we provide now accessibility to our components and so on and so forth, yada yada yada, and for example for screen readers, okay, when do we want this to show is a specific element here, all right, yes, uh, instead of using this area label, which is something that not all browsers actually provide the proper hint to the screen readers. There's some particularly hacks right now that we can use to do so. So in other words, what we're gonna do is to wrap this in a component that makes the uh, element available in the DOM, but not visible for the normal users. Why this is important? Because as I mentioned before, area level sometimes is not depending of the browser implementations. For example, like Chrome's, they are not great uh, at following this kind of stuff, and that's why we have to use this particularly hacks. And you may wonder, hey, how can we do that? Well, by now wrapping these elements and not removing, okay, in fact it's making to be rendered next to the element we want to hide, all right, and then describing is a display inline block. So this describing that this is an inline block. This will be position absolute. This will be a pixel of 1 pixel height and width, all right, and we want to overhidden that, and using the clip here to, I don't know what is doing this. It's like making that element here. So for example, if you add some color here, you say black. Exactly, it's now making that element visible there. Exactly, it's now making the element visible there. But if you for some reason actually is removing that element, but the point of this is, if you want us to make that element is something that can be accessed by screen readers universally without any issue from the browser implementations, this is how you can actually go with. And I do find that it's quite interesting why we have to go through this. All right. And the other is using as a profile with badges. That this might be quite silly exercise, but it's showing now is what we can do in order to render conditional our components for things that are, well, very very interesting, or for conditionally rendered things uh, in this if else statement, right? However, if you have to cover more use cases like that, well, you do need is to go to the ampersand there, right? And checking if this condition is match, if this condition is another match, if this condition is another match, and so on and so forth. So then we look at the range utility, which is useful especially when you do really need to uh, render is collections of values or collections of components, but you are providing is a number to it, right? And how we make a case here of showing us several alternatives of rendering is these elements, okay? And whether it is using as a normal form or a functional alternative. The thing here is, for production code, it is important to make the code readable. We don't want to make any fancy stuff. We don't want to make any things that are clever. We don't want any clever code here. We want is code that can be understood by any other developers, that we don't need to burn extra calories when it needs to identify this the intention of the reader of the code. I do think that is, yes, is is very very important. So yeah, this is also why we look is not only for the for implementation, but also for the JavaScript built-in array implementation when it comes to create collection of values and then populate that, as well as the how can we do that with range or this functional approach, and how now uh, clever code considered harmful. We look indeed a particular exercise of what is happening behind the scenes when we do need is to at least is render this kind of stuff. Not only this, okay, not only render is this collection of values, but also, or the sequence of values, but also is in a grid, okay, and how lengthy and verbose it is for us to actually generate that. And in fact, I create is that piece of code here. uh yeah, this is the exercise 2, rendering a grid. And this is the exercise 1, okay, which is graphics, okay. So this is graphics. Yeah, for this exercise, there actually was not that hard to do that. No, this is belong to this. Exactly. And how can we use this to actually render that? Okay. And how this is gonna look like this? All right. Yep. How this is gonna look like this? There you got it. And the other is rendering a grid. And how lengthy and verbal it becomes when it comes to describe all of this kind of stuff. And why we prefer to go with the GSX plus CSS. Okay. However, there's
So we begin this exercise with.
However, there's some piece of code that we need to inject here. It's something that we're gonna see that later on how to do that, which is exactly what we're gonna do in today's video. So we're talking about now styling in React. This is styling in React. Okay. Styling in React. Okay. Styling in React. So React is unopinionated when it comes to styling. As a result, there are dozens of options out there when it comes to pairing CSS with React. Technically, there is nothing stop you from doing things the traditional way, and you could keep a bunch of CSS files and include them with a link tag in your index.html. But honestly, if you want to have the best experience building with React, there are better approach, or there are approaches that are fit to this tool. Remember when we first talked about components, we saw this particular graph. The core idea with component is that each component is a bundle of markup in GSX, logic, and style. So our bottom component should own all of the styles related to that component. So when we structure our code this way, something magical happens. Working with CSS becomes so much simpler. And here we are talking about is this. Since we can do things the traditional way, way, which is adding CSS, adding external CSS style sheet in our index.html via link tag. All right. To work via link tag and follow some of the some of the CSS methodologies like Ben, like Ben. So Ben methodology. So Ben methodology. Known as block element yada yada. Consulting from an architect, technical lead BBC News, Thoughtbot, Xerox, Google Inc. Oh, that was a tweet back in the old. Holy fuck. Holy moly, bro. Paul Irish. Paul Irish. Holy moly, bro. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. In 2022, holy moly, bro. In 2022. Okay. That was a lot. That was a long time ago. Oh my god. So yeah, you can find him in Master or in Blue Sky here. And yes. Yes. That was in 2021. This actually doesn't load. That's quite interesting. Well, this is the Twitter. You got it. And there you got it. And as you can see here, he is way much more active than it is. There you got it. Okay. Oh, oh, oh. Just like that. Yeah, you got it. Okay. That was my bendy stuff. Alright. So methodologies like Ben. So block, elephant, modifier. Is it block elephant modifier? Okay. Where the idea is to follow a discipline to name follow a name convention follow a name convention to for your CSS for your CSS for your CSS selectors. This require a discipline developer to implement this. And not only that, since this might work well for small projects, but as your project grows, so you will find yourself with long naming convention, not to mention that you will have like global names. The block defines global names defines there. Exactly, define there, which make it very hard to do so. Yeah, which makes very hard to maintain. So in React, okay. So in React, we have a much more simpler way to do this using CSS modules. Which is this particular image, like so, of this. And there you got it. Well, following the component separation of concern, like this. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay, cool. Now, that's when we look at this. Oh, also let me wrap this range utility. Yep. Especially on the range utility here. Harmful. Clever code consider helpful. Okay. Good. Good. All right. So, well, let's get into this, which is CSS models. Here we are. We also explore about this exercise here, and I do find that is quite interesting. Okay. So CSS model, and then you got it. So in this course platform, I have side notes component used to add tangential information. You have probably noticed them already, and they look like this. I'm a side note. I contain some text. Let's build a simplified version of this component. Here is a rough sketch in terms of the props and the markup. And children is something that is injected to the component, and title is a prop that we are also injected, but we are receiving here, right? So this is transpiling to a React component with an aside, nested inside of this another React component with an h3 that the content is title, followed by sibling React element p with the children content, which is gonna now to render all of the children props that is receiving here. Mm. Okay. Okay. Exactly, it's from the previous content. Here's how we style in CSS model. So we look at this. So style wrapper and style title. So here you have this thing called side node.model.css. And what I mentioned before, it was that somehow you are actually taking this piece of code, okay? Somehow you're taking that piece of code, all right? And then create now an object that is going to allow me to access to the wrapper and the title somehow, right? That allow me to access to the content of the wrapper and the title somehow. And there's a lot of weird stuff going on here, and I'll explain exactly how this works. But first, I'd like you to suggest spending a few moments poking at this for yourself. So for example, what do you suppose that style? So for example, if we in this case, if we say, hey, I wanna question. What about this? Right? And then I wanna do is to say, hey, what this styles looks like. Unfortunately, it cannot render objects. Not as a content. Objects are not valid as React child. So if you want to render this, what you can say is, hey, object dot keys of this, all right, object dot keys of this, all right, to render all of this. Or if we want to iterate through all of this, we can say object dot every on every entry of this. We can say something like, I mean, it's values this, right? Where I want to actually is, since this returning us is now an iterator with the key and the value, I do want to know is, what do you have inside of all of these elements here? Which is in the form of a tag here, like key, right, followed by the value, right? And as you can see, this is how these objects looks like. If you have to explain that why objects cannot be rendered here, it is because if you're trying to converse this and you're trying to now, as the children, pass this object, all right, if you imagine that this object is converted to that, what's happening is that that object that is being converted into a React element, the first argument, which is past this div, and the second is this props, and the third is now the children, all right, you are passing now is a children, you are passing now is an object, and you can pass objects to this. You must pass is a React elements. This is why it tells you now that object isn't a valid React element. So yeah, here we are rendering is this, and as you can see, this is how you can actually go and iterate through all of the collections in a particular object. So the smaller the object is, the better off will be for performance. And as you can see here, it's a hey, component, side nodes, model, wrapper 0 with the value 0, all right? And the component side model title 1, okay? The thing here, the curious thing about this is that this style object, it creates these two components here. So it means that when we transpile this, all right, somehow, when we do the style.wrapper, we can have access the content of that, and similar to the title here. If we don't want to get fancy, and in fact we wanted to say this, say console log of styles here. As you can see here, the title and the wrapper, all right? In both of these opportunities, well, as you can see, the title here is now pointing to this stuff, and the wrapper is now pointing to this other stuff, okay? So, but the thing here is that it's actually creating is this long string for us with the particular name. So in other words, CSS actually, or CSS in models, CSS models actually is now creating is a long string enough that is now making us easy for us to access to. So let me actually in fact see what is being rendered here. And as you can see is this component side node model title here and the component side node model wrapper. So this is what the CSS model actually is doing. Is now taking the name, let's say the components, followed by the name of the function, and wrap this into a model name with the wrapper or with the selector here. So it's taking the components, the name of the component, the model which belongs to, all right, side node models, and the selector name to actually is. So if we look at this on the top of a link, right, if I do want to actually find that much more faster than this by saying is this, hey, what is this, what about this? Yeah, but where you can find this, oh, there you go. We can find it is here in this style. So in this style, as you can see, it actually is importing this style in this way. The question is that who is responsible for doing this, all right, and when this actually happens. That's a good question. That's a very, very good question here. Naming the style import in some tutorial for CSS model, the import is named classes instead of styles like this. Ultimately, this is the same thing. Webpack treat the CSS model as a default export, so we can name it in whatever we like. For more information, check out the JavaScript model lesson here. But I do want to know is the Webpack, because I am not quite familiar to Webpack, I must say. Webpack is a bundler. It's the main tool we run to produce our production build of our application. It is rare these days for developers to configure Webpack directly. Typically, we'll use tools like Parcel or Next.js to manage it for us. But it's worth to understanding how the puzzle fits together. For example, you might be wondering if we use Babel to transform our JSX into a browser-friendly JavaScript code, why do we need Webpack? Is to bundle up. Where are the boundaries between these two tools? Is to bundle up, is to bundle up certain code here. Let's get into this.
So here we have the code base for the course platform, the application that you are currently watching a video on. And I'd say it's like a mid-size, small to mid-size application. Just for fun, I decided to count. I used a command line utility called clock, see a video on. And I'd say it's like a mid-size, small to mid-size application. Just for fun, I decided to count. I used a command line utility called...
What is this?
So here we have the code base for the course platform, the application that you are currently watching a video on. And I'd say it's like a mid-size, small to mid-size application. Just for fun, I decided to count. I used a command line utility called clock, C-L-O-C, and it informed me that I had about, I think it was 800 files of JavaScript and TypeScript in this code base, which isn't a ton, right? I've worked on much larger code bases that had many thousands of JavaScript files, but it's quite a... I used a command line utility called clock, C-L-O-C, and it informed me that I had about, I think it was 800 files of JavaScript and TypeScript in this code base, which isn't a ton, right? I've worked on much larger code bases that had many thousands of JavaScript files, but it's quite a few, right? It's enough that it makes you wonder, how that actually works. And this is the big thing that bundlers do, right? Because transpilers like Babel, what they'll do is they'll take a file like this, so src components add bookmark.helpers.ts, and it'll essentially create a new file. It'll put it in like the dist folder, conventionally. This stands for distribution, as in the files that you actually distribute, and it turns it from TypeScript into plain JavaScript and into a browser-friendly JavaScript, right? So no JSX, no super modern, cutting-edge JavaScript features. And so if you point Babel at a codebase like this, you're going to get 800 modern JavaScript files that get turned into 800 browser-friendly JavaScript files. But then, how would I actually use those files? Like, if you had to download 800 files when you visited this course platform, you would still be waiting for it to load. Especially because it's actually even worse than it might sound. There's generally like an entry point, right? So this is, let's say, the first bit of JavaScript that would get loaded. It has to download and parse this file to figure...
Even that he is using this visually hidden visually hidden component, not login, community, course, and links.
Figure out what other modules are necessary.
Standard layout, no login.
So we load the home page and we see, aha, I also need the layout for this page. So then it would go and it would download the standard layout module. And once it downloads and parses this file, it would see, oh, I also need all of this stuff. So let me go get header. And when it downloads, oh, that's the wrong header. It would also realize, oh, I have all these other things that I need. There's this waterfall, right? This cascading effect of it has to download the first file, and then once that's done, it can start on the second group, and then the third group, and this would just take forever. So that's where bundlers like Browserify or Webpack come in. They essentially do all this logic when you build the site, so when you're compiling it for production. It's going to start with an entry file like this one, and it's going to resolve all of the dependencies all the way down, and it's going to create a single JavaScript file that includes all of the code for all of this stuff, so that when you visit the course platform's homepage, it downloads everything that you need in one small, compact bundle. And as it's building that site, it takes advantage of all the tools that we've been talking about. So it'll use Babel as it's going to take the code in this file and make sure that it's browser safe. It'll do the ESLint linting, right? It'll do all the stuff that you would expect during a build process. Webpack is the one synchronizing and orchestrating all of that stuff. And even this, like, it might sound simple, right? Just copy-paste all the files into one big file. But it's not actually that straightforward, because we have this understanding in JavaScript that if I define a function or a variable, right, if I say let high equals 5, we kind of expect that this variable is only going to exist within this file. So if I go to a completely different file and I try to access it, I would expect to get an error. But if I copy-paste this all into the same file, how is that going to work? And it does work. Essentially, it creates little functions for everything, and it manages the dependencies with this idea of dependency injection, right? If I import a file like header, then it means that the code over here will have access to these dependencies, and Webpack has a lot of very sophisticated logic to make all of that possible. We don't need to get into all that complexity, like that's way more complicated than any of us need to worry about, but I do think it's important to understand, because sometimes it feels like we just have all this complexity in the JavaScript tooling ecosystem that just feels needless, but there is a very good reason for it. It's because this stuff really is complicated. And so I think it's useful to know that it's not that we're overcomplicating things and with these over-engineered solutions. It's that we've actually come up with very smart solutions to very complicated problems. These days, Webpack won't produce a single bundle like it used to because, there's quite a lot of stuff in this code base, and it would be a bit of an enormous bundle if you had to download all 800 files before you loaded the homepage. It's able to split based on the route, and this is something that Next.js makes possible. And so if I have a homepage route, I'll have a specific set of JavaScript for that homepage. It's also smart enough to pluck out these kind of shared dependencies, right? I might have 30 different pages in my application, but if it's a React project, all 30 of them need React. And so rather than make the user download 30 different copies of React as they go through the page, it's going to split this into its own bundle, a common bundle for things that are shared across multiple pages. And so it's able to do a lot of really smart stuff that keeps our bundle sizes relatively small, without really exposing us to that complexity. Of course, it's not magic. It does have to be given some sort of instruction to know how to structure that. But these days, a lot of the tools that we use, like Next.js, will manage that complexity for us.
Doesn't HTTP2 solve the performance stuff? HTTP2 is a newer version of the HTTP protocol, and one of the purported benefits is that it speed up parallel file transfers. In theory, we ought to be able to load dozens of hundreds of JavaScript files at once, at once without a performance penalty. Unfortunately, it is not that straightforward. I work for an organization which tried disabling their bundler, and it didn't work so well. Okay. Forgo GS packaging, not so fast. This was in 2015, bro, by Craig Silverstein. Bundling JavaScript files. The traditional advice for web developers is to bundle the JavaScript files used by their web page into one or at most a few packages. Multiple tools have been developed to do this, such as Browserify and Webpack. Vite in this day, they tend to work like this. For a given HTML page, you write a single JavaScript source file that provides all the logic needed for that page. Exactly. All the logic needed for that page. You then use a bundle to create a package that includes the JavaScript source file plus all its dependency needed for that page, and that package is then served via single HTTP request. Okay? So the opposite of bundling is to just serve all of those JavaScript sources files separately. How old is this? And is this still relevant? Khan Academy blog. HTTP2 with its multiplexing, header compression, and the like offer the promise of the best of all worlds when it comes to downloading JavaScript. Great local caching, great download efficiency, no waste byte, and a simpler serving infrastructure to boot. All you have to do is to give up your packaging system and download all your JavaScript source files individually. The reality is not so rosy. Due to the degraded compression performance, the size of data downloaded with individual source files end up being higher than with package. Despite having achieved no waste byte, likewise, the promised download efficiency has yet not shown up in the wild, at least for us. It seems that for the moment, at least JavaScript package is here to stay. This is the Khan Academy blog. That is interesting. The Khan Academy engineer. Rebuilding graph for accessibility inside Khan Academy inclusive design. Communication for custom developers. Meet Suhata Salem, Director of Engineer. Statically typed context in Go. We count on you. Protecting privacy, enabling analytics, beating the odds. Khan Academy successful monolithic service rewrite. Okay. We aim to lower hosting costs, improve performance, and further optimize our already impressive reliability. This was in 2021. Left unsaid that there was that the project Goliath. Interesting. Not only we did land, we did so within 4 months of the initial estimate of completion made 20 months prior. Mm-hmm. Our team embrace, we all succeed or fail together. There were no individual accomplishment, only a solo engineer team accomplishment, with all eyes on the same prize, hitting the MVA milestone. This exceptional egoless team role model selfless collaboration across each and every engineering team member. We are not done, but we can see the finish line, and we look forward to a giant party before the end of the 2022. Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. Why graph accessibility? Where? How old is this? Okay, 2025. Mm-hmm.
Voiceover on Safari. Survey of interactive graph types. Article. Vertical line Khan Academy. Window. Has keyboard focus. Interactive elements. An angle formed by 3 points. The vertex is at minus 3,3. The starting side point is at 3,6. The ending side point is at 4,3. And 2 more items. Group. Article. Survey of interactive graph types. Group. Point 1. Vertex at minus 3,3. Angle 26.565 degrees. An angle on a coordinate plane. Group. Point 1. Vertex at minus 3.1.3. Starting side at 3,4. Point 1. Vertex at minus 3,0.5. Angle 26.565 degrees. Point 2. Point 3. Point 3. Point 2. Point 3. Starting side at 3,3. Point 1. Point 1. Vertex at minus 3,0. Angle 34 degrees. Point 3. Starting side at 2.976,4.0. Point 1. Vertex at minus 3.1. Vertex at minus 3,0. Angle 53 degrees. Point 3. Starting side at 0.037,4.031.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because when it comes to EdTech, they focus heavily on accessibility and stuff like that. Hmm. 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 How old is this? For example, it was in 2012. Hmm.
Once upon a time on the internet, there was Rage. Sir Rage was learning geometry on Khan Academy when he forgot to multiply pi by 2 and got a problem wrong. He should have used Townsend. Now, to be considered proficient and move on, one had to get 10 right answers in a row. Having now to restart from the very beginning with this prior streak of 9 completely erased caused Sir Rage to rage. This was not the only problem at Khan Academy. Our data showed that those who took 30 problems to get a streak performed much worse after a break than those who got a streak in 10. Those are 2 classification errors, requiring some users to do too many problems, while then
Interesting.
through some users who may need more.
Holy moly, bro. Holy moly, bro. Holy moly, bro. Okay. Makes ton of sense. Alright. It should work in theory, but reality is a bit different. It is tempting to imagine a future without bundles where JavaScript where the JavaScript we write is shipped as is to the browser. But honestly, I don't think we'll ever reach to this point. Like I briefly mentioned in the video above, we have run into a cascade waterfall issue where the entry model has to be fully downloaded before we can figuring out what is important. So not only the entry model has to be fully downloaded, but also is to figuring out what are the all the import needs to download. And in all of each one of those import, figuring out what all of this in each one of those files needs to be downloaded. This probably could theoretically be solved by a program that parses our entire dependency tree and figuring out the full set of model necessary for every route. But at that point, why not bundle them together? So this problem could be theoretically be solved by a program that parses our entire dependency tree and figuring out the full set of model necessary for every route. Exactly. So I parse the entire dependency tree, okay, and then this section belongs to this route, this another one, 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 this another one. But at this point, why not bundle them together? Importing assets. So here's a peculiar thing you might see in some React code bases. You got something like this, all right? This isn't actually valid JavaScript because JavaScript cannot import is you will get a syntax error because Webpack is orchestrating our entire build, but this happening is at build time. However, it can take some liberties. In this case, this is allowing us to treat image as if they were JavaScript models, but it's during the development time, during the dev and the bundle and the production bundle. Exactly. So what it's doing here when we do this hot reload models is delegating that to the bundler to say, hey, if you detect this kind of a statement, well, let's go to now import that, make that available here. Make that file available. Because Webpack is orchestrating our entire build, however, exactly, it can take some liberties. In this case, it is allowing us to treat image as if they were JavaScript models. If we were to inspect the bundle output, it might look something like this. As an object here. As a cat source of this. Okay. It's a hey, this will be converted into this one. Hey, this is a variable that this is the path of this variable. All right. Webpack will transform the image import into a standard variable that points to where the image live in production. Exactly. Webpack will transform the image import into a standard variable that points to where the image live in production. By letting Webpack do this, we are able to let it perform certain optimizations, improving performance. Similarly, Webpack let us import CSS file, SVG file, and all sort of stuff. So when do we transform this, okay, for example, into an SVG element, the exact mechanism and optimization used are beyond the scope of this lesson. Okay. The exact mechanism and optimizations used are beyond the scope of this lesson. For the most part, this day, we can let Webpack do anything without worrying about it too much. And then you have other bundlers. I am well aware of this Vite bundler, and now Next.js use TurboPack. So in this lesson, we're using Webpack as example because it is historically been the most widely used bundler. This is starting to change. So you have TurboPack, ESBuild. ESBuild is written in Go, which is a compiled language. And TurboPack. TurboPack is an incremental bundler optimizer for JavaScript and TypeScript, written in Rust and built-in into Next.js. You can use TurboPack with both the page and app router for much faster local development experience. Why TurboPack? We built TurboPack to push the performance of Next.js, including unified graph. Next, support multiple output environments, client and server, managing multiple compiler and stitching bundlers together can be tedious. TurboPack use single unified graph for all environments. Bundling versus native ES model. Some tools skipping bundling in development and rely on the browser native ESM. Okay. This works well for a small app, but it can slow down large app due to excessive network requests. Okay. Bundling versus native ESM. TurboPack bundles in depth, but in an optimized way to keep large app fast, which is exactly what we're talking about the bundle. Despite that the bundle, it is something that we can still use. And since HTTP2 allow us to send doses of concurrent files, this is something that in theory sounds good, but in practice is different. Incremental computation. TurboPack's parallelize work across cores and catch results down to the function level. One piece of work is done, TurboPack won't repeat it. Lazy bundling. TurboPack only bundles what is actually requested by the dev server. But this is on the dev server. It's because on the dev and in the production. Okay, unified graph. Next.js support multiple output environments. Exactly, multiple output environments. Whether it's a client and the server. And then you have the getting started here. To enable TurboPack in Next.js project, add the TurboPack flag to the dev and build script in your package.json. Currently, TurboPack for dev is stable, while build is in alpha. Okay, it makes a lot of sense. We're actively working on production support of TurboPacks. Move closer to stability. Exactly. Okay, exactly. Performance and fast refresh. Unsupport and unplanned features. Legacy CSS module features. It's because this is the model bundler for Next and Vite for the ES build. One is written in Go and the other is written in Rust. Okay, makes sense. And again, one of them is stable in dev, but not in production. Okay. Okay. Good. So language features, JavaScript and TypeScript. Use SWC under the hood. Type checking is not done by TurboPack. Okay, type checking is done by the compiler. Run tcwatch or rely on your ID for type checks. ECMAScript EXNext. TurboPack support the latest ECMAScript features, matching SWC coverage, and CommonJS supported. Requires syntax is handled out of the box. ESM support, static and dynamic import are fully supported, and Babel partially unsupported. TurboPacks do not include Babel by default. However, you can configure Babel Loader via TurboPacks config, which is the transpiler. So TurboPack is the incremental bundler optimized for jQuery and TypeScript, reading in Rust and building to Next.js. Exactly, for a much faster local development experience. Okay, for a much faster local development experience. It makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. Exactly. But what about, okay. And what about for production, bro? Or deploying? Node.js server, Docker, or static export? Route handlers and all of this. Project structure, layout and pages, linking and navigating, serving and client components. Oh, this is how you can deploy with this. Whether it's Docker, DigitalOcean, Fly, Render, SSD. Deploy Next.js with SSD. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Okay. Fundamentally, though all bundlers do the same thing, everything in this lesson is still applied to these modern bundlers. Aside from the fact that different bundlers might use different syntax for non-JS assets. Exactly, all bundlers do the same thing. Everything in this lesson still applies to these modern bundlers, aside from the fact that different bundlers might use different syntax for non-JS assets. The main differentiator between Webpack and this modern alternative is the speed. TurboPack, for example, calls itself a successor to Webpack, offering the same feature set but doing it much more quickly thanks to its Rust-based implementations. Similarly, ESBuild was started because its creator thought that bundler could be 10 to 100 times faster. Ultimately, it shouldn't really matter which bundle we use. This is a low-level implementation detail thing. This day we generally use a high-level tools that abstract the bundler away. It is still helpful to understand how this stuff works at a high level, but the high-level stuff is the same no matter which bundler is being used. But again, I do think this is quite interesting. Okay. Doesn't HTTP2 solve the performance stuff? Again, this might be quite old. In the Khan Academy, some of them might actually look at that. All right. number of peg. Mm-hmm. And then the exercise here. Side node type. In this course platform, I have 4 different types of side nodes components, depending on the status of the things happening. This is type notice. This is type warning. This is type error. This is type success. In this exercise, we'll update our simple side node components to support a new type of prop. A new type prop. This prop will be used to apply a dynamic CSS class. Here's the markup we want us to win up with. The wrapper class contains shared styles, things like the amount of padding or the thickness of the border. The type classes like notice and success contains the category specific style, AJ background. In this exercise, you will implement this pattern using CSS Module and all the styles have been provided. Your task is to apply the correct class name based on the type props. Accepting criteria. All side nodes should have the wrapper class apply. All side nodes should have the wrapper class apply. And the type property of the side node should apply an additional classes, which change the color of the background and border. So you dynamically now is loading that. Exactly. What it is you're receiving is a notice, or a warning, or an error, or a success. Is this one.
So in my app.js, I have 2 instances of the side node component, and they're each being given a different type. And in the CSS file, I have different styles for each of those types. And by the way, this is something I always like to do. If I have a type or a variant or a category that has these like set of possible values, I always try to make sure they are identical, like to the character, as their CSS classes. And this just saves you the little bit of extra work of having to map from, okay, if my type is notice, then my class has to be notice-banner or like whatever derivative thing you come up with. Keep it the same value, saves you a little bit of work. But in the side node component, I have to combine these things, right? I have to figure out, based on this type, what the class should be, and then I can apply it to the aside. So I'm going to start by creating a new variable, class name, and I'm going to use fancy template strings, because I know I'm going to have to do some work over here. I'm going to assign that class name to the aside. And if this was pure CSS, so not CSS modules, I would type wrapper for that base class, and then I would interpolate in type. Of course, this doesn't work, because it's not pure CSS, it's a CSS module, and so I have to use this styles object. So for wrapper, I'll use another interpolation, and I'll say styles.wrapper. And right away, we see that's a step in the right direction. We have this nice border and the padding.
Okay, but in our case, what we're doing is just to get that from the style. And the style is, this is class name. And the class name is, it's because we need to, okay, this is the wrapper. Okay. So one way you can do thing, okay, it makes a lot of sense to do, exactly, because okay. So it makes a lot of sense for us to say, hey, this is the class name, but this actually is reserved. So you can say class, or a class name. All right. So class name will be now is the composition of the side note here, whether it is wrapper, plus the warning here. So whether it's the style dot wrapper followed by the style style dot where here is the notice, warning, and error and all that kind of stuff, as long as I provide is the same type, so I don't have to map that. So when I actually use this, styles in plural, similar for this, now I should be able to use this. But this is using is CSS models
and all of that. And then for the type,
but again, it's because here we're using is on this. Right? And if we want to do this, we can say, hey, styles the title. Right? And where apply is the specific CSS elements to this particular components. Or
type-specific ones, I have to look up the type property on the styles object, and I do that with the square brackets. I need to do that rather than doing like dot type, which I think is an easy mistake to make, because if I do this, then it's actually looking for like a type class instead of evaluating it. But with this done, right, with styles square bracket type, we get the correct styles applied to the correct elements. Now again, important to stress, if this was a real project, I would want a secondary indication for each type, because not everyone can differentiate between these colors, and we want to make sure people can tell if it's a notice or an error. But we're skipping that for here just to keep the code as simple as possible. There is one other thing I want to talk about as we get the correct styles applied to the correct elements. Now again, important to stress, if this was a real project, I would want a secondary indication for each type, because not everyone
a secondary indication for each type.
Everyone can differentiate between these colors, and we want to make sure people can tell if it's a notice or an error. But we're skipping that for here just to keep the code as simple as possible. There is one other thing I want to talk about as well. What do you suppose happens if I flip the order of these two classes so that the variant one comes first? Well, when I do it here, it doesn't appear to break anything, But is that always true? Like, does it matter what order they come in? And I think it's really intuitive to think that the styles that are in this second class will overwrite the styles in the first one, right? Won't it stack them together as if you were merging objects together? And it doesn't work that way. And I can tell that it doesn't work that way, because if I go back to how it was before, and then I come to the CSS file, and I take this wrapper class and I move it to the bottom of the file, look what happens. Our borders lose their hue. And this is the way it works in CSS. It matters based on the order of the definition of the style, right? So if I define my wrapper below, then the border left 3 pixels solid, which doesn't have a color, will overwrite the border color on the specific variants. And if I set a background color to like red, well then they would all be red, because this background color would overwrite that one. It's such an easy mistake to make. And by the way, this isn't...
Okay, it's because this CSS is something that is easy to make a mistake, because the thing here is that these CSS styles actually apply is to the specific CSS models. And it's following is the CSS rule.
CSS module specific. This is just all of CSS, right? That's the way the language works. It does mean that we never have to worry about the order that we're putting our class names in, and this is a good thing. I always like to go from the generic shared one first to the like specific one after, but that's just my own personal preference. But it's so easy to make that mistake, and it's pretty important that you understand that, so hopefully that's helpful.
Absolutely, and especially if you are writing.
So in my app.js,
especially if you're writing your simple, silly exercise component for that. Movie rating animations. Oh, it's this one. Let's suppose we're building a site that helps us to find a new movie to watch. We're displaying some basic information about each movie, including a rating, source from Rotten Tomatoes. Let's do something fun. For movies that have a rating of at least 9.0, we want to add an animation to the rating number. The idea is to highlight movies with great glowing reviews to make them stand out. A CSS class has been provided, glowing review, and you will need to apply this to all ratings that are 9 or above. Don't be afraid to make changes to the markup for this. So we want to apply is this glowing review, where here we have is the animation. So this glow, which is the name of the animation, all right, let's go from this color, the 200 to 260, all right, and then alternate. Interesting, and they alternate from 1.5 seconds and do that infinite, and easing and in out is doing this. So this is the name of the animation, this is the duration, this is the alternate from one to another. We want to do that infinitely, all right? We want to repeat that ad nauseam, and then we want to apply the easing in out. So all of this was mind-blowing, and this is all the heavy lifting here. This is all the heavy lifting here. But if we want to apply, not only is the hue, exactly, if we want to apply not only is the hue, but also, exactly, so if we want to apply is the hue, exactly, if we want to apply is the hue as well as the bounce, glowing review, immediate, prefer reduce motion, no preference, glowing review, glow is this, exactly, here we can list is the number of animations we can put in here. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That makes it, and this is quite powerful here. Okay, cool. Yep, absolutely. 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 Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, because the order here matters, especially in your CSS models, right? Especially in your CSS model. This is the data that we can actually map to and provide to this model movie. So movie is a component function that is going to receive is the key as well as the props. Here, this props will look like this. All right. So this prop is now going to be injected as this object, all right, inside of our function, the movie function. This movie function we're receiving is the ID, the title, the poster, source, as well as the synopsis, and followed by a rating here. Okay, and this is what we are rendering. So we're rendering is the ID, but the ID is the key. We're rendering is the title, poster, synopsis. So title, poster, synopsis, and movie synopsis, and movie rating, right? Movie rating here. And all we want to do is on the movie rating here, the idea is to highlight movie with great glowing reviews to make them stand out. A CSS class has been provided, glowing review, you will need to apply this all ratings that are 9 or above. Don't be afraid to make change to the markup of this. So since this is a condition that we can apply, all right, we can either using is the if and else statement, all right. For doing so, so now on the rating here, we do want to add this. So adding an span here, expandable element here. When we say, hey, we want to now add to the class name is the style, plural. In our case, we are importing this as a style. The glowing review that contains that particular animation that say, hey, this is where it's gonna start. So this is the color, and this is now the animation we want to apply. So we got is this, and we want to only apply for those who have a rating greater than 9. So in other words, we can say is this. We can is just for the sake of the example say glowing, say glowing review, and here we're gonna apply the glowing review to this. If the movie we are receiving, the rating is greater than 9, greater or equal than 9, okay, then I want to apply now this one, right? So put now, so the value will be is this. So the value will be is this. The value will be is this. So otherwise is undefined, right? And here's what we're gonna put it here as a global review, and only those who have higher than 9 or higher are gonna be used to highlight that. Very silly, thin, but yet quite important here.
So we've been given a glowing review class and asked to
So if we clean that up,
apply it to the rating of the movie when that rating is at least 9. And I suppose our first order of business is to figure out where that rating exists, and I do see movie.rating right over here. This is our first hurdle, where I can't really apply a CSS class to a text node like this. And because we don't want the entire paragraph to be animated, we only want the number itself, this is a bit of a problem. So I'm going to start by wrapping the movie rating in a span. And one thing to be very careful about, like notice, I had the space over here, and then I hit save to let Prettier format it for me. If I had tried to indent it myself and then hit save, Prettier wouldn't do that, and as a result, notice that everything is squashed together. So, just important to either let Prettier do the formatting for you, or remember to add a little bit of white space so they're not smushed up against each other. With that done and the span in place, I can apply a class name. And I can't apply it as a string because we're using CSS modules, and so instead I have to pass an expression slot and write styles dot glowing review. With that done, we see the text start to glow and bounce, and that's good news, right? It looks like it's doing the thing. Incidentally, if you don't see it doing the thing, if the text is a light blue color but nothing else for you, it's likely that you've opted to reduce motion. This is an operating system. Here I'm using macOS, but the same option exists in Windows. And if you have this little box ticked, notice now that we lose the animation. So I don't even think you have to worry about changing it. Like if the text is blue for you, that should be good enough. But just to explain why that happens. If you're curious to know how that's set up, well, I've provided the styles. And we can see that by default, the glowing review class only really sets a text color. But then if you don't have a motion preference, which is the default value, then it'll change the display so that the animation actually works, and apply a couple of keyframe animations. So we're in good shape, right? Everything looks to be working properly, but we don't want to be applying this to every movie, right? Honey, I Shrunk the Kids only has 5.4. That's nothing to be glowing about. Incidentally, all these numbers, I just made them up myself, so you may have a very different taste in movies. Maybe you think that Honey, I Shrunk the Kids is a perfect 10, and I would encourage you to make whatever changes you like to the data in app.js. But either way, right, there's going to be some movies that aren't 9 or above, and we want to make sure to not emphasize them. So when I'm applying the class name, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a condition before this, and I'm going to say movie.rating, right, that's the value we see over here. In addition to displaying it, I'm going to use it in this calculation, and I'm going to say that if it's greater than or equal to 9, then I should apply the glowing review class. And so we see 17 again is now back to its normal boring self, whereas Toy Story continues to glow and bounce. To quickly go over how this works, if this expression resolves to true, then this AND gate is unlocked, and we wind up applying this style to the class name attribute. If it resolves to false, then the gate remains locked, and we pass false. And kind of a fun thing that React does is if we say something like class name equals false, React totally ignores it. Like if we inspect that span, we notice that it doesn't even have the class name attribute, even though like clearly we've applied class name equals something. If that value is false or null or undefined, React won't even bother applying it to the span because it's not really a class. So that's my solution, and I'm sticking to it.
Unexpected. Receive false for non-boolean attribute class name. Oh, surprisingly, if you want to write it to the DOM, pass a string instead, class name false or class name value to stream. Hmm. 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 This is not a valid for class name props. Discord user Sarworthy noticed that the solution of providing this video produces a warning. Receive false for a non-boolean attribute class name. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Unless we coerce that into something like this. That's interesting. It's because this is expecting is a Boolean value. This is expecting a Boolean value. And if this returns is a false, this is what the value is going to return. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, what is this doing? Let's take a look. So comparison. Logical comparison. Right? Logical comparison. Where is this, bro? Logical comparison. Binary logical operators, logical comparisons. But if I say comparison, testing and comparison operations, type conversion. No, but this is on the type. Testing and comparison. Operations and objects. Operations on iterator objects. Syntax directed operation. What in the F is this, bro? Wait, what the French stuff is this? What the French stuff is this, bro? Is a bool? Is a logical operator? Exactly, logical relational operators. This one, exactly. So we are doing is this one. So let the left be the evaluation of the relational expression. Get the value of this, okay? And if the value that you get, okay, and now be the evaluation of the shift expression, okay? Get the value of that, and then it's gonna perform if this. If the error, let error be the is less than left value and right value, true. So if error is either true or undefined, return false. Is because here is returning false. Otherwise, return true. Okay. Is less than. So it's performing is this. All of this. And it say, hey, if either true or undefined, is interesting. If error is either true or undefined, return false. So if by evaluating this expression is less than left in a value true, if it's returned true or undefined, return false. What in the F is this? So if I say 7.1 is greater or equal than 9, exactly, it returns false. All right. If this is 9, it's going to return true. If you pass now undefined, it's going to return false. And the funny thing is that because it returns now false, since this is false, right, it's going to return now false. It's going to return is that value. That's what happened. It's because it's returning that warning receiving false for a non-boolean attribute class name. Exactly. And because it returns, and because this return is false, that's what happened. It is return, it is giving a false value. It is giving a false value for a non-boolean attribute class name. And if you want to write it to the DOM, pass the string instead of that. You can say, hey, what happened here is that you are returning is the false value. This is why we need is to say this one or undefined. So once we do this and then we refresh that, there is no error to do that. Absolutely, bro. So it makes a lot of sense. The ternary operator. via the N a false warning. The TL didn't read. Will return operator will return whatever falsy value, will return whatever falsy value operand 1, which is this, will return whatever falsy value operand 1 will return whatever falsy value operand 1 return will return whatever falsy value operand 1 return. So in other words, it is safe to use to have much more control of the output of the comparison output. The runtime semantic evaluation is null, undefined, empty string, nan, 0, -0, and false will return whatever falsy value, null, undefined, empty string, nan, 0, -0, or false is this one. This is falsy values or to Boolean. of the comparison output. Holy moly, bro. Okay, so all of these nuance are important to know. And it's telling you here, there is nothing weird or wild of this. It's like, no, 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 no. It's everything is here, bro. Everything is here. So there is no weird stuff going on here. Ay, aquí no vive nadie. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.